Greetings! I'm Aaron Balavey, and this is me, Chuan Guandao Fa, Secretly Transmitted Methods of the Guandao. This is my series for talking about all things Guandao. In this video, I'm going to be talking about a particular text, a 17th century military treatise called Wubei要略. And I have talked about Wubei要略quite a lot on this channel because it has a lot of good information about Guandao. I'll probably be repeating some things I've said in the past, but I think it's worth to kind of repeating them in the context of looking at this text. So the text as a whole covers lots of different topics in warfare and martial arts, and it's quite long, and I'm sure there's lots of things that are kind of worth researching and worth talking about. But there's only so much time in the day, and I'd rather spend that time looking at the Guandao section. So that's kind of what I've focused on, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in this video.
So you might have noticed that this video is quite a bit longer than all of my previous videos, and that's basically because there's just so much to look at in this text and so much to kind of talk about. And so I'm going to kind of end up getting a little bit, or bouncing around to different parts of the text and looking at a lot of different things. But I think it's probably good to kind of keep in mind these two questions as we go through it. That is, first, that what was this text used for? Historically, what was its intention? Why was it created? And then what can we do? What can we learn by looking at this text? So we as martial artists who are interested in Guandao. And I'm going to look at a lot of I'm going to go down lots of rabbit holes and drift from these two topics, but good things to kind of keep in mind, and I'll talk a little bit more about these topics at the end. Also, you probably also can tell by now that I'm going to use a lot of screenshots in this video, and the sound quality is pretty uneven. So apologies for the scratchy microphone recordings I'm going to be using in this video.
Now, before we jump into the Guandao section, I'll just say a few words about the author of this text. So the author is Cheng Zi Yi, and we don't know very much about Cheng Zi Yi, but we do know that he is the nephew of Cheng Zi Yi, who is another kind of writer of important military treatises of the time. He wrote the earliest extant text to talk about the Shaolin staff method, and he also wrote a couple of other texts about other weapons. The men of the Cheng family were not actually career soldiers, but rather they were literati. They were educated elites. And, I guess it wasn't uncommon at the time for educated elites, for literati, to learn martial arts and to be interested in martial arts in this way. It's not like they were just nerds or something like that. But certainly knowing this background can help us understand the text in some ways, or kind of might influence the way we interpret it. So something to keep in mind. But other than that, let's jump into the text.
Actually, sorry, there is one more thing I want to mention before we get into the actual text, and that is that there is an English translation available for the Guandao section of the Wubei要略, and that is available by Jack Chen through ChineseLongsword.com, and I'll put a link in the down below. It is a decent translation. I would say that there are parts that I really like and found helpful, and then there were parts that I don't like as much, that I have some little problems with, but overall, it's pretty good. And obviously, if you don't read Chinese, it's very, very, very helpful. And even if you do read Chinese, I think it's always helpful to get somebody else's perspective on interpretation. So I would recommend you check that out. Okay, so this is the contents page for the Guandao section of the Wubei要略, and the section on Guandao is about 20 pages in all. So we're looking at this. So the beginning, we get a couple pages that are sort of introduction to the weapon. First, kind of a general introduction to the weapon and how it's used, and then an introduction that talks about how it's constructed. And then we have this really long section, the vast majority of the Guandao section as a whole, that goes over particular stances with the weapon. And then at the end of the Guandao section, we have this a form that is presented, so like a taolu or a kata that kind of pulls all the moves together. Okay, so these are the first two spreads of the Guandao section of Wubei要略. This first spread is talking about kind of a general introduction and how the weapon is used, and the second spread is talking about what the weapon looks like and how it is constructed. And I'm going to talk about each of these sections, each of these spreads separate or independently in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about a couple of things looking at the two of them together. And so the first is that the term used to refer to a Guandao in this text most of the time is 大刀. So every word you see circled in red here is the term 大刀, which basically means big blade, or like, maybe great blade or something like that. And so in some of the more recent videos I've been doing, I've talked about doing searches in databases for Guandao and using Dadao as a reference point, as kind of a term to refer to Guandao or other Dao polearms. Now, it's a tricky term because it could be that this term is also used to refer to other weapons. I haven't found really direct evidence of that, but I think it's very likely. Still, in this text, clearly Dadao is referring to Guandao because it's used a lot, and this section is about Guandao. And then right here we have a picture of a Guandao with the word Dadao right there. So we know that that term means Guandao in this text. Another term that is used for Guandao in this text is yaolüe Dao, and I know that some martial artists prefer to use this term to refer to Guandao, and I think that makes a lot of sense because this unambiguously refers to a Guandao. It's always used to refer to a Guandao. And then also it is kind of a term that describes the shape of the weapon. So a reclining moon blade. And I did an entire video talking about different names of the Guandao. I'll put a link in the down below. You can check that out if you're interested. But I will point out that in this text, the yaolüe Dao is used almost, I guess you could say it's used a little bit more formally. So this first usage here, oops, losing control of my mouse. Okay, so this first usage here is kind of quoting from an earlier text. And so it's probably just using yaolüe Dao because whatever the earlier text is, it probably used the term yaolüe Dao. So it's quoting from it. So it's just using the same term that that original text used. And it's probably an earlier text, so it's kind of using an earlier name for it. And then the second usage here is talking about the shape of the blade, and that's why it uses it's saying that it's basically saying that it looks like a half a moon, so that's why it's called a reclining moon blade. So they're using that name specifically because they're talking about the shape of the weapon, and that's why it's called that. So these two uses are kind of like very specific, almost more formal usages, whereas when it's just talking generally about the weapon, it uses the term Dadao. So I think that's something important to point out. Another thing I'd like to point out is that I like to look at the very beginning of these two spreads and the very end. So right over here, we say we're talking about the Dadao, and then we're also talking about the Zhanma Dao. So it's basically saying that everything we're saying in these sections also applies to the Zhanma Dao. And then right here we get a picture of a Zhanma Dao. So Zhanma Dao is a term, it can refer to different kinds of weapons at different times. Sometimes it's talking about polearms, sometimes it's talking about great swords. But in this section, we can see clearly from the picture that we're talking about another Dao polearm. And comparing it to the Guandao, they really look quite similar. They both have crescent-shaped blade, slightly curved blades, and a shaft, and then a spike at the bottom. And so the beginning of the text is kind of suggesting that they're used in a very similar manner, that they're kind of, more or less interchangeable. But the Zhanma Dao, it definitely looks a little bit leaner, a little bit, slimmer, probably a little bit smaller, and a little bit lighter. But I guess we're to assume that they function in a very similar way. So I think that's kind of important information to think about. So here is the kind of the first introduction section that talks about how the Guandao is used. And I'm not going to translate it for word, but I'll kind of go over it and give a summary of different parts. So in the beginning, so it's talking about how with the Guandao, it's a cavalry weapon, and it requires the skill of a general, and that is not for infantry, or it's not useful as an infantry weapon. and that if you're going to use a Guandao, you have to be very strong, and you have to have a fast horse, and you have to have good technical skill, and you have to be able to uh, beat away your opponent's weapon and then close the distance. And if you do so, you will certainly be successful. And it talks about how you can lead with the edge of the blade and have the drill in the back, the drill or the butt spike in the back, or you can hide the blade and have the drill in the front. And it talks about the basic cuts and chops. So there's the liao, so an upward cut, pi, a downward cut, go, a hook, can, like a chop, which I think in this text is usually diagonal or horizontal, and a tuo, which means to drag. And it talks about the kind of the general tactic for using the weapon on horseback, and that is to pretend as if you are fleeing so that your opponent chases you, and then you suddenly turn and chop him down. It also talks about why the weapon is less useful or not useful as an infantry weapon. It says that you once you have beat your opponent's weapon away, once you have hooked it or gotten out of your way, then you still have to, somehow rotate or cross step your way in order to close the distance to get to your opponent. And so, I guess presumably that is not efficient and not effective enough for the author of this text. And then at the end of this section, he talks about how, so basically, even though he's saying it's useful as a cavalry weapon, but not as an infantry weapon, he says, but, most people learn how to use the weapon on foot first before they start learning how to use it as a cavalry weapon. So in this text, he presents, a bunch of different stances for using the weapon on foot. So I think it's kind of important to point out that this last section, these last couple of lines sort of set up the entire Guandao section as, okay, this is explaining how to practice with the weapon on foot, even though eventually you should be using it as a cavalry weapon. Okay, so this section talks about the construction of the weapon and what it kind of looks like and what the different parts are and the hardware of the Guandao. So it talks about there being three parts, that there's the blade, the drill, and the haft, and that the blade should be 1/3 of the height of the overall weapon. So if your weapon is 6 chi and 6 cun, the blade should be 2 chi and 2 cun. And it says that the blade should be shaped like a half moon. It says that you should use forged steel to make the blade. And it says that there should be medial ridges on both sides of the blade. So we get this nice medial ridge in the center of the blade, just like a jian, or a straight sword. It says that there should be distal taper on the blade, and that it shouldn't be too curved. I'm not exactly sure what too curved is. This is pretty curved, it looks like to me. So I could imagine not wanting to get too much more curved than that. And it says that the drill should be shaped like spinach leaves. I'm not sure I really see spinach leaves there, but that's what it says. It says that there should be an exquisitely crafted dragon blade collar, twin coal, and it says, and it says that there should be a leather sheath, or a sheath for the blade made out of leather. And then at the end, it says the most crazy thing in here that, I just can't figure out what's exactly going on here, and that is that it should weigh from something between 10 to 20 jin, which is the equivalent of about 6 to 12 kilos or 13 to 26 pounds, which if you've ever done any messing around with weapons, I think you'll understand. If you've ever paid attention to the weight of weapons, this is crazy heavy. So like even the lower measurement here, so 10 jin, 6 kilos, 13 pounds, that's crazy heavy. So then to have the upper end, the upper limit here being double that is just astonishing. And then in the last sentence here, he goes on to say that the limitation of the weight on the weapon is your horse. So if you have a really good horse, you don't have to pay attention to this rule, and you can have as heavy of a Guandao as you want. So if you have a good horse, your Guandao can be more than 20 jin, or 12 kilos, or 26 pounds, which just seems crazy. So what is going on here? Were they really wielding Guandao that were that big? So I think there are a few possibilities of what's going on here. One is just that there's some kind of mistake, or some other kind of clerical error. That doesn't seem too likely to me. Another possibility is that he's just telling the truth, that they were wielding weapons that were super, super heavy. And I used to think that this was a ridiculous idea, but honestly, I've been practicing with I've been kind of experimenting and researching iron stabs, and so I've been messing around in my backyard with a steel rod that's about 6 feet long and weighs 14 pounds, which is very, very heavy. But honestly, I think it's feasible. You can wield it effectively. You wouldn't want to wield it in a duel, and you would definitely want to have a lot of armor on. But I think it could be very effective at killing people. So maybe they were in fact using super, super heavy Guandao. And actually, since this text is emphasizing the use of the weapon as a cavalry weapon, that might explain why they're using very, very heavy weapons. Maybe since they're on horseback, they don't really need to maneuver the weapon very much, and they're just using the momentum of the horse to do damage and to wield the weapon, basically wield the weapon for them. So that could be the explanation there, right there, is that a very heavy weapon on a horse was effective in the eyes of this author anyway, in this text. Possible, but who knows? I guess the last possibility is that the author is intentionally exaggerating the weight of the weapon here. And I think that that's also quite possible. So, in fact, I think that the specific reason he may be doing that is the weapon's connection to the god, Guangdong, Lord Guan. And so I have an entire video on this that I released very recently. I'll put a link in the down below. Um, the weapon, the Guandao, is totally connected to the mythology around the god Guangdong. And this section, this text so far, the whole Guandao section, never actually mentions Guan Yu or Guangdong by name, but the author's kind of hinting at it throughout this whole section. So if we go back to looking at the first two introductions together, just a couple of reminders. So, he's talking about it being the weapon of a general, or, requiring a general's skill. And we're talking all about it being used on horseback and requiring, you have to be very strong to use it, and, very technically capable, and you have to have an excellent horse. And then, at the end, he says, if you have an excellent horse, your weapon can be basically as heavy as your horse can handle, as heavy as you want. And I sort of wonder if this is sort of hinting at the mythology of Guangdong. Guangdong is known to have had, or is said to have had, an 82 jin Guandao, which is just, fantastically heavy. But he's also known to have had an amazing, an incredible horse. So maybe that the author here is sort of trying to reconcile reality with the mythology of Guangdong, and so even the lower end measurement he gives of 10 jin, or 6 kilos or 13 pounds, maybe the weapons he was using were closer to that lower end, or maybe not even to that amount of weight. But he knows that his readers know that this is supposed to be a very, very heavy weapon, so he decides to just kind of embellish, exaggerate, to fill in the gaps a bit. I think that's a possibility. I really don't have a definitive answer for why the author gives this weight, whether it was true, whether it was a lie, whether it was a mistake. Any of these could be possible, could be true. But I will say that I have never seen an antique weapon that is close to that heavy. So antique weapons, it's very hard to find ones that are fully assembled. But even when we just have the blade itself, the weight usually falls in somewhere between 1.5 to 2 kilos. So if you fully assembled the weapon, it probably wouldn't be too much more than 3 or 4 kilos at most. So something I'll add very quickly is that, so in this earlier section here on the Tiebian, so the Tiebian is a bar mace, an iron switch. And in the Wubei要略, the author apparently uses a two-handed version of this weapon. And it a lot of the technique sort of follows the Danda Fa Xuan, so a text that, or a technique that is for a two-handed saber, a two-handed dao, a sword, a two-handed sword. And this section also gives a weight of 10 to 20 jin for this two-handed bar mace. And this I can't explain. There's no way, I can't imagine how you would use a bar mace, a two-handed bar mace that is 13 to 26 pounds in the same way that you would use a two-handed sword. So, this is the same weight given for the Guandao, and it really does raise suspicions. I have no idea how the author expects a weapon this heavy to be wielded like a two-handed sword. So that's something to keep in mind. So let's move on to the next chunk of the Guandao section of the Wubei要略. This is the largest kind of subsection of the Guandao section. This is where the author describes particular stances used with the weapon. And there are 12 different stances given. They each kind of follow the same pattern, which is that, they have an illustration at the bottom of the page, and then there is a title for the stance, and then a description. And the descriptions are kind of uneven, I'd say. But let's look at one in particular to kind of give an example of how these stanzas work in the text. So let's start with this stance as an example. So maybe a pretty literal translation of the title of this stance would be something like left lifting upward cut blade stance, something like that. And so the way most of these stance descriptions work is that it's not just a description of the posture itself, but rather it gives you context. It tells you what happens before you get in this stance, and then it tells you what you do after you get in this stance. So this one, it says to start in a different stance. It says to start in standing left-looking stance. And it says that when you're in this stance, your right shoulder will be facing the enemy. So we can see in this illustration that the left shoulder is facing the enemy. So we know that we haven't gotten into this posture yet. The author is still describing the previous posture. And it's worth noting that previous posture, it's given a name, but it's not described in this text. So you can kind of you can cross-reference it with something like Danda Fa Xuan, like a sword text, to get an idea of what that posture might be. But the author kind of just assumes you know what he's talking about. He doesn't give that information. So the opponent will thrust their spear at you, and you use the back of the blade to hook and open up your opponent's spear and advanced with a left step. So stepping with the left foot. So now we see in this drawing that the left foot is forward, so now we know we're getting closer to the stance. From below, diagonally cut with an upwards cut and advance. So here we see, so this is where we're getting into the stance we see below. So this is a diagonal upward cut from below. Again, your left shoulder is facing the enemy. Again, so now we see the left shoulder is facing the enemy. Now we're in this stance. The enemy will again thrust at you. And so advance with your right foot and diagonally chop. So now we're getting past this stance where the enemy thrusts at you again, and you advance with your right foot and then you chop with the weapon. And then your right shoulder is facing the enemy. The enemy will again thrust at you, hook with the blade, and enter and chop. So the description really goes quite a bit far beyond the stance given here. And it describes, I think, 3 different thrusts from the enemy. and it gives us a lot of context for where this stance might be used. And I think the fact that these stances are presented in context is pretty important. I suspect that since this is, some kind of an instructional manual, that these these instructions given could be used for drills to practice with a partner, basically. So, since we have probably 3 or 4 exchanges in the description, you could have a sparring buddy, take a spear, and you could use the text above as kind of like a set of moves to follow for practice. And both of you could kind of work on getting faster and getting your form right and that kind of thing. Just like everybody does when they're sparring. This is a pretty common way to practice martial arts. I don't think that the author's suggesting that this exact set of moves is the only way you would use this stance. It's just kind of one example, and maybe it's one example given with the intention of using it for practice. And each of the 12 stances have them, so that gives you 12 separate different drills that you could run with a partner for practice. Except that I guess not all of the stances really seem equally practical. So right here we have this other stance called like throwing the blade stance. And so this stance, it doesn't describe the enemy attacking you in the same way that the previous stance did, but rather it talks about this kind of move you do where you swing the blade over your head and catch it in your shoulder, and then you throw it into the air and catch it. And it doesn't provide any kind of context in the sense that it doesn't tell you, how to use this against your opponent. And I mean, let's be honest, how on earth would this be effective? Just tossing it up into the air and catching it. It's pretty clearly a kind of performative move that, for one reason or other, it seems like people like to practice, but, probably just because it looks cool. And if it's, a very heavy weapon, then, tossing it up and catching it looks kind of impressive. And there may be echoes of this in kind of the mythology of Lord Guan. I've seen, different texts that talk about anecdotes about people either wielding dadao or like about Guandao himself, about raising the weapon up into the sky. So maybe there is kind of this kind of performative resonance there. But clearly, some of the stances are rooted in practical use, while other stances are or have some other kind of function, have some other kind of performative function. So that brings us to the last spread in the Guandao section of the Wubei要略. And this section describes a form, a taolu or a kata. So it's like a series of movements that a single person can perform as practice. And it focuses on the stances that are described in the previous subsection. So on the right page, the first page here, we have just a description using words of how to perform the form. And on the left side, we have this kind of map or chart that sort of tries to provide a little bit of visual information about how to perform the form. So it's, I guess the simplest way to read is to think of it as like a bird's eye view of how the movements are supposed to work, except that it's not really proportional. If you were to actually put a camera above someone performing the form, it wouldn't look exactly like this. And I think that this is just a convenient way to illustrate the form, because if you actually did a bird's eye view of what the form looks like, you'd have to have the characters overlap and kind of write all over each other, and it would be a big old mess. So it's sort of like a bird's eye view, but it's not like to scale. It's not like proportionally accurate. It's just to give you an idea of what direction you should be performing the movements. So the text on both of these pages are kind of similar in format. So on this right side, on the larger characters are mostly just the names of stances. And then the text in between them, that's smaller and runs on 2 lines. This text describes other movements that will help take you from stance to stance. So it's the things that happen in between the stances. And similarly, in the form diagram on the left side, so the stance names are written a bit larger and they are enclosed within boxes. And then there's running text that goes between the the stances, and this just describes smaller movements that take you from stance to stance. Now, since they follow this similar format, you might expect that they are the same, and you would be wrong, of course. There are kind of subtle differences between the two. Sometimes it's just a case of abbreviation. So, this the diagram side on the left, there's less space there. So they tend to abbreviate movements more often. They might take out a character if you can still figure out what they're trying to say, that kind of thing. But sometimes there's just different information in the two. And to make matters more complicated, the information on these 2 pages is usually quite different from what we see in the stance descriptions from the previous subsection. I'm not going to go into detail on all of the differences, but maybe as a bit of an example. So there's one section that talks about going from this stance, an upward cut with the foot raised stance, to this stance below, the single carry stance. And this happens in the full form towards the beginning. It's this long line right here. So here we're looking at the description, which is on the right page from the previous slide. And here's the form diagram, so the left page from the previous slide. And here's the stance description. And so this stance description is the most worthless stance description in the text. It just tells you that, this stance appears in all of the different Dao forms, so we're not going to talk about it here. And that's all you get. You get that, and then you get this illustration here. So not much information to go on. And then, so these two, the form description and form diagram, are quite similar, but they're also a little bit different. So for the form description, he talks about, so you advance with your right foot, and then you do a 5-flower spin to the right, advance with the left foot, enter, and then enter with the right foot. And on the form diagram, we get, so you advance with your right foot, enter with the left foot, and then over your head, do a 5-flower spin, or rotation, I guess you could say. So a little bit different information between these two. And I would say, so I've spent a lot of time trying to decode this form, and I've kind of made my own interpretation of it, which I'll show in just a minute. But there were a lot of things about this that make it very tricky to try to recreate the form. And so one of it is just understanding the terms. So in both of these descriptions, we have this 5-flower turn, 5-flower rotation. And this is a term, wuhuar. We hear this quite a bit in modern martial arts, and not just in Guandao forms, but in all kinds of Dao forms. Wuhuar probably referring to a plum blossom. So a plum blossom has 5 petals. So that's why you get a 5-flower. It's probably talking about a plum blossom. And we see plum blossoms as a kind of an image in a lot of martial arts forms. There are lots of Mei Huaquan, plum blossom boxing, these kinds of things. And so the term wuhuar, I tried to, get a sense of what this might mean. And in the form that I practice in my tradition, we have this term comes up a couple different times in the Quanpu, in the kind of the instructions for doing the form in my tradition. And in my tradition, and also, so there's a wuhuar. So it's different characters. There's another one, it's wuhuar. Instead of being a 5-flower, it's a dancing flower. So it uses the character wu for dancing rather than the number 5. But it's a homophone, and it might be referring to the same move. So they have that in the Guandao form from the Chen style family, from the I think it's called Chen Shi Chunqiu Dadao or something like that. And in both, in the Chen style form and in my form, this rotation is a rotation that goes vertically. So it spins. So you spin the blade from the bottom to the top, or vice versa. So from the top to the bottom. So it's a rotation in this direction. And so when I was trying to interpret the form, I spent a lot of time looking specifically at the form description section and looking here and trying to figure out how that's supposed to work. But it was only until I started looking at the form diagram that I realized that it goes over your head, this mantou. So these added characters, that indicates that it goes over your head. So as I understand it now, I don't think it is a vertical spin. I think it's a horizontal spin that goes over your head. So you spin the blade over your head. I certainly could be wrong about that, but that's the current way I choose to interpret it. But then, if you're only looking at this form diagram plot, you're also missing a lot of information, because the form description also gives you much more detail on what the footwork looks like. So, in order to recreate the form, you really have to be looking at both the diagram and the description. And I'll just mention real quickly that that is one kind of major deficiency I see in the Jack Chen's translation, is that they only provide a translation for the form description. And I guess they assume that the form diagram is the same, or they just don't bother translating it. So if you're only working from the translation, that is unfortunately one kind of major limitation to be aware of. So I have a little more I want to talk about with this form, but I think before I move on with the discussion, I should show what I've created. So I'll put on my interpretation of how this form should be performed. I'll say that it's absolutely not 100% correct. I'm sure I have lots of mistakes. You know, it might only be 20% correct or 10% correct. I really have no idea. I've just done the best I can do, kind of using what I know from my own tradition and what I'm able to understand from the text, and just kind of playing around with different movements, trying to figure out what makes most sense. So, you know, undoubtedly, I've got there are places where I'm pretty sure whatever I'm doing is wrong, but it's a starting place. So if you see something in this section that you think is off, please let me know in the comments, and I will try to see if I can make it right. So a couple of things I'll mention about this form and about kind of the process of recreating it. So I'll say that I don't find this to be it's not a very long form, and I don't find it to be particularly complicated or really all that difficult. But it does kind of pull together all of the different stances described in the text, and it is kind of, I would say it feels fairly elegant to me, and kind of fun. So it's a nice little form. And as in terms of kind of putting the pieces together and trying to decode how to perform it, my initial assumption was that the stance descriptions in the text would have played a bigger role. So as I was talking about before, these stance descriptions give a lot of context. They tell you what happens before the form, and then they talk about what happens after. And so this description we looked at before, it talks about, you know, after you get into this stance, there are two more thrusts that come at you, and you hook the opponent's spear, and then you enter and strike. And it's probably hard to notice, but in the form that I've recreated, I don't do those movements. So I'd originally assumed that everything in these stance descriptions ought to be repeated in the full form. But as I tried to kind of reconstruct it, I realized that that was almost impossible. So a lot of times the movements in the stance descriptions, they just don't line up with the complete form description. So if you follow everything you see here, maybe your footing will be off and you won't be able to do it, or the weapon will be on the wrong side of your body. So they just kind of, they don't mix, they don't go together. But rather, if you only look at the stance itself and then follow the moves in between, that's how I arrived at the form that I came up with. I found that if I made the stances as lean as they could possibly be and pretty much just focus on the stance itself, it was pretty easy to put the whole form together. Whereas if I tried to rely on those stance descriptions, it just kind of turned into a big old mess. And the other thing is that it got too repetitive because the stance descriptions inevitably end with hook your opponent's weapon and chop them. Like that's just always how the stance ends, which is practical. It makes sense. That's what you want to be doing with a Guandao is you want to hook your opponent's weapon and then chop them. But in order to put the moves together in a form, you just end up chopping and hooking and chopping and hooking and chopping and hooking. That's all you do if you put it in every time. So I could be wrong about that. It could be that you should include all of the movements that are here, and maybe the author assumes that you need to kind of on your own add extra steps, extra movements in order to connect the pieces. But I took the opposite approach and trimmed all of that off and just focused on the stances and the descriptions in this form to connect the dots. So I would say that even if you don't read Chinese, if you don't have a translation, that'll make things tough for sure. But in that case, I think looking at the stance description illustrations still makes a lot of sense. It's still a very valuable resource. And if you're practicing Guandao on your own, I would definitely still use these illustrations as a reference. So another thing I'd like to mention is that there is one stance in this form that appears quite often with much greater frequency than any other stance. And that is the so-called single carrier stance, the danti dao shi. So seems like kind of an unusual stance to be repeating a whole bunch. And it's something that there are similar stances for other weapons in which you hold the weapon kind of behind you at your back and you extend your left foot or your left hand towards your opponent. That appears a lot in other polearms, and it appears a lot in single-handed sword Dao forms. And a lot of times the context in which I see it discussed is, why on earth would you do this? It just seems wildly impractical. And actually just had a long discussion with some other martial artists about potential practical applications for this stance. So there are some, so you could be extending this hand with the intent of using it to deflect an oncoming attack. It's not easy to do, but it certainly is possible. You could be using it to engage in some kind of grapple. You could be using it as kind of to bait your opponent. So, since you're making yourself an easy target or getting them to maybe strike at your hand or to come at you so that you can be on the defensive because you have some kind of, plan. So you're luring your opponent in. Certainly a possible use of the stance. Some people, in the case of the single-handed sword, some people say that the left hand might have represented a shield. I think in this case, with a Guandao, that seems wildly unlikely because you wouldn't wield a Guandao in one hand and a sword in the other. And I certainly have never seen evidence of that being the case. So that one I think we can probably rule out. But I think some of these other, potential practical applications are valid. I think that you could use this stance as a means to that end. However, in this form, I think that when you look at the entire form, this stance has sort of kind of an unspoken function that is sort of interesting to think about. So the single carry stance are the places that are circled in red. And it might not be totally obvious just glancing at this diagram, but every time that that this stance is used represents a change of facing. So up here, you're facing this direction, you're moving this direction, and then you get into that stance, and now all of a sudden you're facing this direction. And then you're going this direction, and then you get back in that stance, and then you're facing this direction. And you go all the way through, and you get down here, and then you get into that stance again, and you're facing this direction. And in fact, basically every time, every time you use this stance represents a change of facing. But also, there are only two instances in this form in which you change your facing, but you don't use this stance. So one of those instances is down here, and that stance is this stance over here, which is basically the same thing as a single carry stance. You still have your left hand extended, and you're holding the weapon behind you on your back. The only difference is that here you have your leg raised. So it's basically the same stance, just with your leg raised. And the second instance in which you change your facing, but you're not using that stance, is down here. So this is really the only exception, and that's this stance. So it's this kind of upward cut with your leg raised. But by and large, every time you change your facing, you're going to get into this single carry stance. And so to me, what it seems like is that single carry stance marks the beginning of a new set of moves. So we're going through here, we're going to change our facing, and now we have a new set of moves. And then we're going to get back into that stance because, like, okay, that set of moves is complete. Now we're on to the next set of moves, and we do a bunch of moves here. And then that set of moves is complete. Okay, we're starting over. So in a weird way, that seems to be kind of the stance's function. It's this like reset or this restart. Now, I'm not really sure why you would choose this stance as your restart. Because again, as we were saying before, there are some maybe practical implications of it, but overall, it doesn't seem like the most practical stance. It's tempting to say that this is kind of a convenient way to carry the weapon, but I would say that it is not a comfortable way to carry the weapon. Holding it behind your back like that, the heaviest part is in the blade, and if you're carrying it at an angle on your back, that really is quite a lot of weight on your right arm, and it's an awkward way to carry the weapon. It's not very comfortable at all. If you were to take your left hand, bend it at the elbow, and grab onto the base of the blade and carry it on your back like that, that is actually very comfortable. So I suppose that could be a possible reason that maybe this weapon is carried in that way normally as you're walking around. So that's why it's the starting position. But I mean, it doesn't say that in the text, and I've never seen it depicted that way. I've never seen anyone carrying a Guandao backwards like this on their back with their left hand. If you have seen that, any examples of that in art, please, please, please let me know in the down below. I would love to get that confirmed somewhere if it is the case. But in actuality, my feeling on this is we should kind of just look at what the text says and go with that. And what the text says, is when it's talking about this left-hand posture, it uses the character yin, or in the phoenix stance over here, it's ying di. So this means to greet or to meet the enemy. So we're greeting the enemy, we're meeting the enemy. It's basically like I think of it as Morpheus in the Matrix. I think we're just kind of challenging our opponent. We're going to face them head on, so we're putting our hand out to kind of, say, come and get me. Now, does that mean we're baiting them? I'm not really sure. I think, baiting, to me, that means that you're trying to trick your opponent into making a particular move so that you can, respond the way you want to respond and attack them. But I think that would be a dangerous thing to do with this posture, because there's really only one thing you can do when the Guandao is behind you like that, and that is swing it across the front of your body and around so that your left hand can grab the back end, and so that the weapon is in front of you. And that is a very predictable move if your opponent has ever fought somebody with a Guandao before, and if they ever use the stance, you know exactly what they're going to do. So I think that it's not really that practical as a baiting technique, and it's pretty dangerous. So so my assumption really is that there's something performative and kind of cultural about this. You are challenging your opponent. You're saying, "I'm here, come at me." You know, it's kind of like in a Street Fighter 2 video game or something. This is your ready position. You know, you're about to engage with them. So it's like, come and get me, let's fight. That's how I'm kind of inclined to understand this position. But regardless, it seems to be kind of the default starting position presented in this form.
So, just some kind of final concluding thoughts. So, what was this text for? How is it intended to be used? And then, how can we use it today in martial arts practices? So, I think, in terms of what was this text for, was it, primarily a training manual? Was it for practical application? Was it sort of performative or cultural? I think the answer is all the above. So, explicitly in the beginning of the text, the author talks about using it for cavalry, but then that, when you're training with it, you usually start on foot. So, he presents different scenarios for practicing for using it as an infantry weapon. So clearly, it had some use as a training manual. And yet, when we look at the particular stances, the descriptions very clearly talk about actual situations you would end up at, actual combat application, what to do when an opponent stabs you when you're in this position. And, how is each stance used in context against an opponent. So it wasn't as if it was, purely like athletic training, or it wasn't, solely performative. And yet there are elements that are clearly performative, or kind of cultural in some respects. So there's the kind of extending the left hand with the single carry stance. I think there's some kind of cultural element to that. But then there's also instances where you're spinning the weapon above your head or wrapping it around your waist. And these are movements that I think we can safely say weren't intended primarily as for practical use in battle. So if the text originally was, for training, but had elements of practical use and then also performative elements, how are we as martial artists to use this text today? And I think, that's a kind of a tricky question. And of course, it depends on why you practice and how you practice. But I think that if you are interested in sparring, or in more interested in the practical application of the weapon, I think focusing on the stances section makes a lot of sense. You and your sparring partner who is using a spear, because this is all, the context of using Guandao within this text is against a spear. And I think generally in the late-Ming and Qing, that would be your opponent. That would be your biggest obstacle if you were a Guandao user. So, use these stances. You and your opponent should kind of follow what the text says and, practice them just like drills. And I think that will give a good understanding of how the weapon may have been used for infantry. And then the form at the end, I think, is also a kind of a very good resource for modern martial artists. And I think part of it is just because, if you've learned Guandao before, you've almost certainly studied a form. That's how it's taught these days. It's not very often we see dueling Guandaos out there, although I'm sure there are some. But so if you can decode this form for yourself, either from, what I've put up, or if you can work with the text and try to figure it out for yourself, I think it's very useful to, see how the author presented this form, the movements, how he connected the different stances and incorporated different movements. And then also as a comparison to modern forms, because when I'm doing that, when I'm comparing this form to the form in my own tradition, I certainly see some very kind of obvious differences. But then at the same time, I see a lot of similarities. And I think kind of building an awareness of where they overlap is very useful, because it teaches you, what in your tradition might be something that has longer legs, that has, been around for a while, whereas what other movements might be sort of newer or come from different influences. Now, this is only a single historical resource, so of course we can't assume that, all people in the late Ming and early Qing were fighting the exact same way. And in fact, the evidence seems to be quite the opposite. But since this is a very good kind of solid resource with a lot of content, I think it absolutely, deserves a lot of attention if you are into Guandao like me. So that's all I have for this video. This is probably my second to last video. I plan on doing one last video where I kind of give a lot of concluding thoughts, particularly on the second season I've been doing, where I would like to kind of bring a lot of my ideas together and just kind of share the kind of the bullet points of what I think are worth knowing about Guandao. After that, and it might be a little while before the video goes up. I'm expecting a second child soon, and who knows when that will happen. So it might be a little while, but stay tuned, and I'll see you next time on 秘传 Guandao Fa, secretly transmitted methods of the Guandao.